Welcome everybody who is here sitting in the Spire Calistoga tasting room. My name is Ryan Hughes. I'm the estate manager. Of course, Chris Carpenter here to my right. Welcome everybody watching online. I know I already have Pennsylvania in the house, Tennessee in the house. I've got Illinois. So I'm really excited that we get to do this both live and also through the power of Zoom. So what we'll do, of course, is sit down with Chris, kind of pick his brain about Cabernet Franc, find out why Cabernet Franc, why on Mount Veeder, what was the kind of the origin story behind it, and really what I'd like to do is we'll have a little Q&A, of course, at some point here at the end. But Cabernet Franc is a grape you don't see usually by itself in Napa. Of course, Lahota, we've had it up on Howe Mountain for quite some time and just absolutely stunning, as many of you know. But what made you start Cabernet Franc on Veeder for the 13 vintage? And also, really, really importantly, can you help me tell everybody out there, I think everyone here doesn't think this, but why do people think Cabernet Franc is only a blending grape, which clearly it is not?
That's a lot to answer.
I know you can go long, so don't worry. Technical difficulties. Just hold on one second. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I do want to answer all those questions, but let's go back a little bit and talk about Cab Franc and its place in the history of wine. So I did a little research. One of the first mentions of Cabernet Franc comes by way of the 17th century cardinal of note, Cardinal Richelieu. And if any of you have ever read Dumas, you would recognize Cardinal Richelieu as the main protagonist in the Three Musketeers. And apparently he was also one of the main guys who liked his wine, and he helped to spread initially Cab Franc in the Loire, and then ultimately to Bordeaux. In Napa County, the first mention of Cabernet Franc is in 1860. And I couldn't find out exactly where. There's different spots in Napa Valley that Franc has been around, but the origin moment here is hard to track down. Right now, there's about 1,100 acres of Cabernet Franc planted in Napa Valley. To put that in perspective, there's 21,000 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon planted in Napa Valley, and about 4,000 acres of Merlot, two of the other wines that I work with. So that's 63% of all grape acreage in Napa is Cabernet Sauvignon, making the Franc portion 3%. So it's still pretty small plantings. I think we think of it as a blending grape mostly because of its history in Bordeaux, outside of some of the great right bank wines, like particularly Cheval Blanc, because mostly in Bordeaux it's used as a blending grape. If you look at what happens in Loire, most of it is 100% Cabernet Franc, and just a very different style than right bank Cab Franc. So, and it's also market driven, I think, to a certain degree. Not a lot of people were calling for Cabernet Franc, where Cabernet Sauvignon has been a variety of note that the consumer ultimately has been asking for. And Franc was kind of the left out stepchild, when in fact, as many of you know, it's the father of Cabernet Sauvignon. And it was interesting, I was flipping back through the internet and a bunch of books. Yeah, books still have information in them. And I had a copy of Jancis Robinson's her wine compendium that I had bought in 1998. And if you open that and read what Jancis wrote, she wrote that it's likely that Cabernet Franc stemmed as a clone of Cabernet Sauvignon, which is something that my colleague Carol Meredith put to rest many years ago. Carol, as you may or may not know, was one of the great geneticists at UC Davis, also owns Lajer Meredith up on Mount Veeder. And she made the connection by way of early DNA testing that Cabernet Sauvignon is actually the progenitor, along with Sauvignon Blanc or Cabernet Franc, and Sauvignon Blanc is the progenitor of Cabernet Sauvignon. A pretty cool story, and Jancis, I'm sure, has updated her book there. How did I get involved in Cabernet Franc? The very first Cabernet Franc I made was actually from Sonoma County in Knights Valley. So one of the wines that I make is Cardinal. And Cardinal used to source not only here in Napa Valley, but over in Sonoma. And one of the great source points for us was Peter Michael's Les Pavots, one of the great vineyards in this neck of the woods. Actually, right over the hill, about 2 or 3 miles away from here. We used to get both or all Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Franc. And in 2002, I made this awesome Cabernet Franc off of that vineyard. It was so good. And I was trying to figure out, okay, what can I do with this? It was initially brought in to use as a blender for Cardinal. It didn't work as a blender for that. And 2002 was the first year that we made Napa Valley the exclusive source for Cardinal. So then I didn't have a place to put it. And I went to the marketing department and asked them to consider this wine, because the wine was just so good and so different than Cabernet in several different ways. And we'll talk about that as we get into the wines. Ultimately, marketing couldn't figure out a place to put it. I bottled 1 barrel of that wine. And now that I'm saying this, I should have brought a bottle with me. And stashed it away. And every once in a while, we'll drag a bottle of that or a case of that out, depending on the event. And it's still a wine with great resonance. Cab Franc kind of then faded from my awareness until we bought La Joda. And when we bought La Joda, along with that acquisition came the brand of La Joda and the vineyards. And one of the very old Cab Franc blocks in Napa Valley, not the oldest, but probably second or third oldest, William Smith, who was the founder of the second iteration of La Joda, planted 1976. And we still have that block of Cab Franc up there. And along with it came one of the very few wine mixes that had a Cab Franc wine in it, the La Joda Cab Franc, which I was super excited about because I could go back and I had a place for Cab Franc finally, and a brand that had helped establish the understanding of Cab Franc. And we started pursuing that. And in fact, the first couple iterations of our oversight of that vineyard and wine was very popular to the point where I could start planting more Cab Franc. So on Howell Mountain now, we have 9 acres of Cab Franc, where we had started with just the one at about, I think that block's like 2 acres of the stuff that was planted in 1976. So that has grown. And then it got me thinking about Cab Franc in other places and about the benefits of Cab Franc. And one of the big benefits of Cab Franc is that it's an early ripener. So you plant it in places that you may have difficulty getting Cabernet Sauvignon up to par, or that Merlot just wouldn't work for whatever reason, again, either market-driven or given the soil profile, because Merlot needs a different kind of soil than Franc does. So I've planted it in other places. We've got half an acre in St. Helena. We've got 1.5 acres in Oakville. We have 4 acres on Spring Mountain that contributes to a Cab Franc project that I'll talk about in just a second. 2 acres on Diamond, same project. And then on Veeder, we have about 4 acres. And all 4 of those acres I had a hand in planting, and all 4 of them were planted not only because of this burgeoning interest in Cab Franc, but because they were in the ideal places to plant Cab Franc.
So, question for you though: the Lahota, Howell Mountain soil, and the Veeder soil, are they similar though? You said you just kind of brought, like, sometimes the soil is. So did you find a plot that said, hey, that soil reminds me of Howell Mountain?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, it wasn't because of the soils that I made this decision. It was because of the challenge with the ripening spot on this particular area. The soils I knew could support Franc, because most of the same soils that can support Cabernet Sauvignon can support Franc. But this particular block, the block that we're going to taste through today, was probably one of the more informed and successful planting decisions I've made. So part of what I do as a winemaker is also I'm very much involved in the vineyard. And one of the more important parts of my work in the vineyard, besides the actual farming, is making the decisions as to what varieties are going to go in different areas of each specific vineyard. And when we took over the Mount Brave property from Chateau Patel, and we acquired that, Jess Jackson, our founder, didn't want to do a Chardonnay project, and there was some Chardonnay up there. So he asked us to think about this area where the Chardonnay had been growing. And I started looking at this area, and this area is right on a hillside. It's got almost it's almost a due north face. And not only does it have that challenge, but it is right next to a stand of enormous Doug firs that block probably 1/3 to 1/2 of this vineyard from the sun each day. So I'm thinking about this, and we did a number of studies looking at the relative temperature and the shading over the course of the vintage and over the course of the year. And this might be the perfect area for Cab Franc, and something that can ripen a little bit earlier, but still gain from all those things that we see up at Veeder. And went ahead and planted the Cab Franc. And the first year we made it, I was like, man, this is a dynamite wine, and presented this as a possibility to grow the brand opportunities. And I had the benefit of doing that to our marketing and sales department because we had so much success with the Lahota brand. And it would be a counterpoint to Lahota as well. It's clearly a Veeder Franc versus Lahota. Before we go into the wines, and any questions that you might have, I thought I would also mention some of the other Francs that I do make now. I make the Lahota Cab Franc. We make now a multi-appellation mountain Cab Franc called Caledon, and it's a Cab Franc Merlot blend, and it's my homage to the Right Bank, and particularly to Cheval Blanc, one of my favorite wines in the world. And it is very different than the Veeder and the Howell character off of Brave and Lahota, in that it's much more elegant because it's driven much more by the red fruit and the floral notes coming from Diamond and Spring, and so it really dovetails with a Right Bank expression. And then I also make one in Australia. And in Australia, we're a really unique Cab Franc in that most of the Aussies are making Cab Franc in that Loire style. And that Loire style is much greener, much lighter body, much more crunchy, herbaceous tannins. And with Right Bank style, you got to push that a little bit more, and you have to have, again, the right area to grow that in. And the Aussies, there's one particular area that was focusing on Franc in more of that Loire style, and we're probably one of the very few that has the Right Bank style there. So Franc is a really cool variety that I've learned to love and embrace. And I'm really excited about this tasting because I haven't tasted this lineup ever. I mean, I've tasted these ones, but I haven't gone back I've never gone back across the course of it. And we're tasting every wine, I think, except 13, the origin wine. Right?
2013 is the only one that we are fortunately just didn't have enough to be able to see today. But we'll start with the 14. And I will say that with your Cabernet Francs, each expression are completely different. And so he is like how he paints the Cab Francs differently. They do not taste the same. And I love about Mount Brave for you, La Joda, I think you're always, those 76 vines are always going to be like, this is how we're going to taste.
Yeah.
This is what we're going to do. And that's a beautiful thing. What I noticed is, and I got to try these today, and I think you will all see that as well. You'll see the vintages are all completely different. It's such a great expression, each vintage here. So you want to start with the 2014?
No, I thought we'd start in the middle and fan out.
I love Chris. I love this guy. I love this guy. Anyways,
start with the 14.
Okay.
So these are, what I will say is these are all 100% Cab Francs, I believe.
There's a little bit of Cab in the 14.
Except for the 14. I've made a lot.
So maybe we should start in the middle.
Yeah, I've made a lot of blends over the year. What was the percentage?
Oh, gosh, like 15%, give or take, something like that.
Oh, that high.
Yeah. Well, it was an early, so 14, of course, as you remember perfectly, 14 was an earlier ripening vintage. So maybe that was the decision. Yeah. And it was the second year too. So you're still getting to.
And I will say that in an earlier ripening vintage, again, the Franc is always the first to come off. So this is, and I will guarantee you, this was probably the second or third block that particular year, really probably early September. I don't remember exactly when I picked this. But I think about Franc because it has some characters that if I was to treat it with the same kind of oak regime would be lost in the oak. So most of these Francs are in the 60 to 70% new oak range. They are meant to preserve not only that red fruit and red like rose petal character that you can get from Franc, but some of the more Vider-esque characters like the violets and the blueberries and such. Yeah.
For the neophytes, can you explain your comment on it would get lost in the oak?
Yeah. So oak is meant to frame wine, right? And it's meant to support it and to fill gaps in whatever holes are in a final raw wine before it goes to barrel. And I look at that, every wine that I ferment before it gets laid down, I taste it and see, okay, do I have a gap in the middle? Do I have a gap at the end? What are the floral notes on it? What are the fruit notes on it? With Cabernet Sauvignon, you can, especially mountain Cabernet, those gaps take a lot more oak to fill, and the oak can support it at a much greater volume of oak. If you put too much, excuse me, put too much oak on a wine like that, especially with the floral notes, the characters, the flavors that you get from the oak will overwhelm the more delicate flavors. And depending on the cooper, drives a lot of that as well. I would never use I love Demptos, but I would never use it on a Cab Franc because it's just the style that I go for in my barrels. It would just overwhelm it. So I'm using a much more finer grained barrel, one that again doesn't have as much of an impact and helps to lift a lot of the more delicate characters. You're welcome.
Let's look at this 2014.
He's aged anywhere from 20, well, actually in 17, we aged them only for, I think, 16 or 17 months up until 22 months. And again, that depends on the vintage and how much I think that vintage can carry the oak.
So we roughly get about 300 cases each year on this, so just enough, few barrels there. I love the softness already on the 2014. What goes through your mind as you think about when you were blending this, when you were making this, when you're tasting this? What goes through your mind?
Well, when I'm tasting older wines, the first thing I'm looking for is how much fruit is being carried over on that wine and where have the tannins gone. Franc has this thing where the tannins can be a little bit awkward at the tail end. And a lot of how I'm thinking about this wine during the aging process is to smooth out that tannin. It's like the difference between driving, if you're driving on a gravelly road and suddenly you hit the brand new pavement and you can feel it change on the tires of your car from that graveliness to that smoothness. It's the same thing with tannins. And Franc, it's oftentimes really gravelly. And again, people that are making that Loire style and drinking that Loire style, they kind of like that. With this style, that's not the case. And I'm tasting this going, wow, this still has a good amount of fruit in it. It's got a great mid palate. And the tannins have softened at the end to a great degree, but not too much that you don't know that you're having a mountain wine that's 10 years old.
Yeah. And do you have to, with Vitre Cabernet Franc, do you have to struggle with the Priazines, or is it Vitre just allowing you're not fighting the Priazine and getting that green flavor, which, sometimes Cab Franc can just express a little too much?
Yeah. So Priazines are the characters that create that bell pepper, the green character in Bordeaux wines. And different varieties in Bordeaux have different levels of Priazines. Cabernet Sauvignon, probably the least amount. Merlot, probably the most amount. And then Franc, Malbec, probably the least amount as well in that same category. But it's a different kind of herbalness in Malbec. But Petit Verdot and Franc have it. And with Franc, again, if you were to taste Loire style wines, that's what you're expecting, because those are being picked really early. I'm not picking that early. And we're in an area, again, Franc does well in the area that we're in that's shaded quite a bit, but we get enough sunlight that those compounds develop. And part of the benefit of growing on mountain terroir is you get a tremendous amount of sunlight for a longer amount of the day. So you're at elevation, so you're closer to the sun. It's only 1,600 feet closer, but we all know the difference between being at the bottom of a mountain and the top of a mountain as far as that sunlight. And because we're above the fog line, we're getting that sun for a longer portion of the day. And that helps to change the pyrazine character of wines, the bell pepper character. It's one of the things that when I'm making my picking call, I'm looking at every Bordeaux variety should have a wee bit of it because it signifies the Bordeaux variety. But an overt amount of pyrazine can really detract from the great fruit character that you get. And one of the other things that I would think about with Cab Franc is Franc has this great synergy between red fruit, like that almost those Italian cherries that they use in cocktails now, and black fruit, which, you think of blackberry and boysenberry and some of those kind of fruits. It's got a great balance of the two. And part of what I think about when I'm tasting Franc is where is that balance? And, is it expressive of Franc in that way?
And even with your Higginbotham, the nest, I mean, that, even though it's Loire style, I still don't see that green. You still find a way to get that balance. So it's beautiful in how you do that. The other thing I think you're talking about too, and we've had this discussion a few times, is it reminds me, Cabernet Franc from the mountains reminds me a lot of Nebbiolo.
Yeah,
and it's got that cranberry and
not quite the tannin.
Not quite the tannin,
but it definitely has
that flavor profile.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and a little bit of less of the body that you might expect out of like a Cabernet Sauvignon.
Absolutely. So 14, absolutely beautiful, super pretty. And then we go into now 2015. We're talking about third drought now.
Yeah,
3 drought years, low volume. Besides those, we were dealing with the drought. What else do you remember about 2015 as a vintage?
Well, it was another early vintage, and it was an early vintage driven by the volume. There wasn't a lot of fruit. Of the teens, it was probably the least amount of fruit that we that we picked that year. 17 was the least amount of wine for a very different reason. But 15 was low fruit, so we got it off early. Franc actually did pretty well that year because we had an event during the set when the fruit is going from flower into fruit, or the plant is taking the flower to fruit, that knocked a lot of the set off of already weakened vines by way of the drought. So yeah, you should taste it.
I've always remembered when I tried this as being the darkest vintage, and probably due to that so far.
What's the elevation at
Hickenbotham is about 1,000 feet. So that's one of the reasons that I planted the Franc in this particular area, because I had the elevation. I knew I had very similar soil types. I had soil that was pretty even as far as its depth, and no eucalyptus trees around. There's eucalyptus trees everywhere around this vineyard, but this particular block doesn't have it. And I didn't want the eucalyptus character fighting with the Cab Franc character because they're both, again, very delicate. So
the acidity in the back end on the 15 is
pretty good,
just outstanding. That's one of my favorite things about Cabernet Franc. I love the acidity, how it kind of follows back there. For me, versatility wise, Cabernet Franc doesn't necessarily have to be that huge protein style of wine. So Chris, with that being said, what are some of your favorite pairings with Cabernet Franc food-wise?
Lamb.
Yeah, sure.
Lamb is probably top one. Black cod maybe would work. That's the thing about the Franc is beef will always work with a Bordeaux variety, whether you're drinking Merlot, Melba. Thank you. Do I get a little over me?
You got a little there. Okay, you're good. I was trying to be subtle.
Can't take me anywhere. But I just had lamb actually with a bottle of Cheval Blanc last weekend.
Who didn't?
And it was spot on, man. And I was thinking about this tasting and about how good.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah,
appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to brag just a bit. It was a 47 Cheval Blanc that I had that lamb with, which was just mind blowing how well. And that's the other thing with Franc. And when you're seeing this in, just in a decade's worth of time, it ages exceptionally well, and that 47 sure aged well.
I would, disclaimer here, we don't own Cheval Blanc, but if you haven't had the opportunity, the 2004 Cheval Blanc was one of my absolute top 10 wine experiences for sure. Jamie, a question in the back there.
Yeah, so for those of us that can't afford a $20,000 bottle of wine, you brought Cheval Blanc up a few times. I recently looked it up because I'm sending one of our collectors to Lisay, and it's like 10 minutes down the road from Cheval Blanc. And I think I read it's 100% Cab Franc now at Cheval Blanc.
Yeah, they vary the percentages even more drastically than I do with Caledon. So some years it'll actually be Merlot driven. Some years it'll be Cab Franc driven, and they'll play around with it. It may very well be. I haven't kept up. I only drink 47, so.
Well, being that it's your birth year, that's fantastic. Yeah, good. So.
Yeah. For those of us that haven't been able to have Cheval Blanc, and you said that was your inspiration for this, were there characteristics in Cheval Blanc that you tried to show in this?
Well, not in this one as much as in the Caledon Cab Franc. And those characters are the more elegant expression of the right bank. This wine and La Joda have a little more of that Napa Valley weight and power and energy. But you can have energy that's different, right? That still is beautiful and not to be, and I'm not sexist. You can have Marilyn Monroe beauty and you can have Audrey Hepburn beauty. Very different, right? But they're both beautiful. And
I think we're doing Taylor Swift now. I think.
Yeah.
He's aging himself from 47 again, so, you know.
Yeah, classic.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But that's so when I was thinking about Caledon and what Spring Mountain brings to the table and what the Diamond Mountain brings to it, it's all about that subtle beauty, that more, I don't know, sophisticated
Finesse over power.
Yeah, versus these wines, which have more curves and have a little more, they're more bombastic as far as how they present themselves. Even though it's Franc, it's still got that power.
Jessica Rabbit, she's not bad. She's just drawn that way. So on that segment, 2016, another fantastic vintage. You finally saw a little bit of rain in that winter there. As once again, as you try this, what are you thinking about this particular vintage?
So this is for me a very classic Franc character because you're getting a little bit more of that green character in here. There's a lot more of that red fruit showing, at least on the aromatic. And this is 16 through and through. This has got, 16 had, as Ryan was saying, 16, we had some rain. We had a great growing season. So it was long, drawn out. We could bring the fruit in. We didn't have any moments that we were panicking in 16. And I don't recall what I was thinking about this wine, but it is that more, there's almost like a laser focus on the fruit in 16 with that nice, just subtle bit of green that's carrying it along.
It's definitely brighter red, not bright, but brighter comparatively to the other two.
Yep.
But once again, the acidity just follows, which I love about it. Now, here's a question just off the cuff, quite frankly. Now you're starting to have the vines seeing more age as well. So the vines themselves, remind me, were they grafted or were like planted? Okay. So at this point in 2016, how old are the vines, if you remember?
So our first vintage was the 13. So I think we planted these in either 10 or 11. Okay. Yeah, I don't recall the exact.
Does that make a difference then? If we're starting to get to that 7 years old or so?
But this again is one of the reasons I think about this block as being such a great decision of planting this variety there. When you plant new vines, you typically don't expect the fruit to start showing well till third or fourth harvest. By third leaf, you're getting fruit coming off of the vine. But usually it's really tutti fruity. It doesn't have a lot of structure, and that's across all the Bordeaux varieties. But every once in a while, you can't, you have to leave your expectations at the door because every once in a while, the fruit right off the get-go will be fantastic. And what I have found with Franc is more often than not, Franc is that variety that starts performing right away. Hickenbotham in Australia is the same thing. That first vintage, we only made 30 gallons the first vintage that we got the Hickenbotham fruit, and it was outstanding. And I knew going into the vintage after that I would have the opportunity to present again to our marketing team an idea around that wine. And I'm thinking back to all of the Francs that we have up on Howell Mountain that we've planted over the years, and they've all done exceptionally well for us right off the bat. So the vines will mature, but I've not had a problem waiting, on that.
I do find, and many that are in the station room have visited here before, and they know it with Hickenbotham, I'll pour the nest a couple of years behind because it's just so tightly wound that acidity just needs to calm down. Yeah. So if we're pouring the 20, Truman Cabernet, I'll probably be pouring the 18 nest. It just seems to work that way. So I'm not going to.
You tasted a lot more than I do.
I do. And thank God you're good at your job.
Yeah.
So, all right. So not going to tip my hat, but so far I'm liking the 16 the most. So of course, we tip our hat to 2017, as we all know, troublesome vintage beyond the wine world. Everyone was affected from ways that were, catastrophic, quite frankly. But 2017 was starting to show off a pretty good vintage. And then October 8th.
So yeah, the 17 was before the fires happened. So when I'm in the midst of harvest, people will go, how's the vintage going? Like, is it the best vintage ever? If I was French, I would say it's the best vintage ever. just stand by my guns. But I'm one of these people that maybe 2 out of every 10, I can tell you this is a darn good vintage while it's fermenting. There'll be another section, maybe 2 out of the 10 at the other end. I'm like, nah. And then most of the time I'm in the middle. Like, I don't want to jinx myself. I want to see how the wines evolve and come around after a year and a half when I sit down at the blending table. 17 up until the fires was one of those vintages like, wow, this is a really good vintage. It was one of the best vintages that I had experienced. And we picked every bit of Cab Franc before the fires. So that brings up another point. As we think about varieties to plant in California, as climate change becomes a more impactful, even more impactful than it is now, to different ag industries and our industry, the vineyard ag side of it, Franc is one of those varieties that I'm firmly in a place of saying that we should be planting more of, because we can get it off the vine earlier. And we need, and it has, again, you're seeing, it has a lot of the same kind of characteristics that Cabernet Sauvignon does, and a lot of the same ability to age and turn you on the same way that the other Bordeaux varieties, but it gets off the vine earlier in many cases than Merlot. So thinking about 17 and how successful we were in 17 with Franc, I think 17 was 17 the first vintage of Caledon, or was it 15?
15. Yeah. So, 17? 17?
Was it 17?
I have 60 other wines to think about.
Yeah,
so Caledon is down the road.
So 17 was the first vintage of Caledon, which is the multi-appellation Bordeaux blend. So that, those kind of decisions that we hadn't had to have made 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we're having to make more of. And Franc is one of those varieties that is resilient that way.
Is Franc Malbec first, though?
No.
This is nonsense. Okay. Because I know that Malbec was one of your senior thesis about a double pruning technique.
My master's.
Your master's.
Yes.
1947. Yeah. And so we have that, but going back to it, so I will, forgive me, that little ADHD question has nothing to do with Cab Franc. So that being said, with the 17, for me, I am getting a darker fruit for sure. And that's what I've loved so far about what we've seen with Cabernet Franc off of Mount Brave. Each flavor is, it doesn't have to be a specific fruit, right? I always like to talk in color. So this is more of like a blue, a black.
Well, I was just going to say, this one thus far is showing a very key appellation signifier for Viter, and that blueberry pie thing that I'm getting off of this. That is Viter on so many different levels, but there's a great middle palate to this wine, a great weight, and the tannins have resolved themselves really well. This is what I would expect the 17 wines to taste like. And can you imagine if we had gotten Cabernet off of some of our vineyards, and La Coya being another wine that I make, what those would have been?
Yeah, but the little bit of Mount Brave that you did get in was a totally different animal.
Yep.
And of course, pat on the back, top one, Wine Spectator, top 100. We just didn't have enough.
Yeah.
It is. But so I'm seeing the structure. You are clearly seeing a little bit more tannin as we're going along. Obvious when you have those wines here, but I'm still noticing that acidity still hitting the back of my palate, the back of my tongue.
When did you pour these?
We poured these. Well, we opened them around 1 o'clock. poured, got some splashes out. And then we poured into glass right around 2, give or take, I'd say.
So one of the cool things, you all know this, is these wines, mountain wines tend to evolve a lot in their glass. And these will continue to evolve as those tannins get oxygen, start creating those linkages.
So after Mother Nature was cruel to us, and once again with 2017 being much more than just to think about the vintage itself, about what happened here in California, we finally are going to both 18 and 19 with some of these big, beautiful vintages, starting with the 2018. Once again, as you're trying this 2018, what are you thinking about the vintage?
Well, 18, these 2 vintages with a great contrast to one another, 18 and 19, and not from a growing standpoint. The growing years were very similar to one another. There's the way we didn't have as much water again in 18, but it's showing just what I would expect out of 18. 18 is really a bright fruit character, and 18 has always had this awesome structural tannin that this wine is clearly presenting, and it's much more fruit driven. When we get to the 19, you'll notice a more savory character to the 19, and the tannins are a little bit more developed. It got a little warmer at the end of 19, so those tannins developed it with heat. And so at that tail end of 19, things started warming up and creating a little more of a softer expression of the wine.
Yeah, a little showier. Yeah. Yeah, in a good way. The other thing too is obviously feel free, go back forth, try them, pick those nuances, and everybody at home, go back and forth and really kind of pick up those nuances that 18 may bring out of 16 or 16 may bring out of 19. Absolutely recommend that. But luckily enough with your Corbin, if you have your pivot, you can stretch that out and have it keep going with next couple of days, a week or so. I love it because it allows me to not open a whole second bottle and drink the whole second bottle, quite frankly. But the pivot is one of my favorites at home personally.
What is the pivot?
The pivot. What is the pivot? I'm glad you asked. Is this a commercial? So the pivot is Corbin's, I would say newest. And Peter Johnson is here from Corbin. Happens to be here. So he will answer questions better or absolutely.
Have you shown me the pivot?
I don't think I've showed it to you.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. So this is where you actually take the cork out and then use a rubber stopper to pour yourself a nice big glass, and it just kind of extends the life.
Kind of like the follow-up to what you did for the Stelvin in Australia?
Correct.
Yeah.
It promotes consumption because the wine for 30 days.
So do we.
Yeah.
So it's fantastic. We're simpatico with that. So anyhow.
Glass on Tuesday, finish it on Saturday.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it useful at home for sure, Peter. It is one of those more I have that glass of wine, let me just, have this, like Lahota Chardonnay. I like to stretch that. I have one great glass a night kind of thing. That's what I love with this in particular. So, but yeah, so, you can use this at home and, stretch these out and try them after a couple of days. Anyhow, the 18 versus 19, to your point there, it's kind of a, flashy vintage. It has a little bit more of that softness and suppleness.
Well, 18, I think, is flashier. Yeah. 19 is more savory.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the difference between a episode of Magnum PI and a Sam Spade detective novel.
At some point, you could say Terry Savali. We're going to be got it all. So we're going to, yeah. Who loves you, baby? But yeah, no, but the acid on the 19 is definitely up front.
Yeah.
It is just the edge of my tongue. It's just biting at.
So we don't have, as Ryan has alluded to throughout the tasting, the acid portion of my wines is super important. It's important on a couple of levels. It again is a marquee of mountain viticulture. Heat, as I mentioned, will drop tannins. It also drops acid. What happens in the mountains is all that cold air that rolls off of the bay in the evening cools the mountains down first. So when that phenomenon is happening, all of those chemical processes that are going on in the grape to drop the acid, to drop the tannin, slow down. And so you preserve that natural tannin and you preserve that structural component, which is part of the one of the great advantages of growing in the mountains is you have structure, you have tannin, or you have acid, and you have, the ageability that comes along with both of those things.
Does that give you an advantage to get Cabernet Franc, like, not more right? I hate to use that word, but do you have a bigger window to just nail Cab Franc as opposed to, say, Napa Valley floor?
Yes, but in a different way. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Napa Valley floor
No, for sure.
Francs, but they may not have the same acid.
Yeah.
And acid is the other part of what I was going to say was acid is to winemaking what salt is to chefs, is to cooking. There's a window of when you put a little salt in something, in a soup that you're making, for example, you can have a little too much or a little too little. And there's this perfect place to put that salt, right? And when you nail it, what the salt does is it enhances how we experience the flavors and aromatic compounds. So having that salt there kind of lifts everything. It's the same in wine with acid. Acid is part of the expression not only of the mountains, but it's part of how those aromatics carry for a long time and how they hit your palate and how they ultimately get into your olfactory senses in the back of your nose. And so acid is super important to the expression of the place and how I want these wines to show themselves from a flavor and aromatic standpoint.
Beautiful. We've had some great questions, obviously, here in the room. And I believe, Taylor, we have the chat open. Has there been some great questions? I know Ted Landers in Tennessee has probably got a few. I know my guy, Ted, he definitely has probably a question or so. Any great questions that stand out? Oh, they're all great questions, of course, but any questions that stood out to you?
We don't have any yet, but I'm counting on
Ted. Ted, come on. You were texting me earlier, Ted. Come on. So Jamie, yeah.
Do you make any non-mountain wines?
I do, but they get blended. So I make wines from St. Helena, from Rutherford, from Oakville, from Yountville, from Stag's Leap, and they're all part of Cardinal. So Cardinal is another one of the wines that I make, and it's a multi-appellation blend, kind of giving you an idea of Napa Valley in its entirety, and how I can take all the differences of the Napa Valley and bring them together and make a wine that has a lot more breadth, if you will, a lot more complexity. And the valley floor components play a really crucial part in the middle texture of Cardinal, some of the sweetness that Cardinal expresses itself as well. Yeah, Jamie.
The 17 Cab Franc was the first Mount Grey wine that I fell in love with, and I was reading the wine information sheet that we get working as employees, and I noticed that this wine gets malolactic conversion, and I don't think I heard about that talked a lot with red wine. And then the more studying I did, I learned that it happens with almost every red wine, but I feel like you described it as kind of a vanilla character that I think rounds it out a lot. Can you maybe explain how the malolactic conversion works with this particular wine?
Right. So there are two fermentations that happen in red wines. Sometimes you let them, it can happen in white, sometimes you don't let it happen. One is the yeast-driven fermentation, which is the alcoholic fermentation, converts sugar into alcohol, modifies some of the flavors. The other is carried out by a bacteria. And the bacteria consumes a particular kind of acid, malic acid, and converts it to lactic acid. It basically drops your acid number by about 1/4%. So that your wines aren't driven completely by the acid, that you find a balance point there. I do that process in the barrel. You can do it you can do it in the same tank as the yeast while the yeast are working. You can do it after you've pressed it and it's sitting in the stainless steel. I do it in the barrel, and the reason I do it in the barrel is because during that period, the barrel is releasing some of their flavors into the wine. Alcohol is a solvent. Alcohol draws out the characters that we want from the barrel. If you draw them out in excess, again, you swamp some of the more delicate characters of the wine. You want to try to get this coming together of the flavors that you're getting from the barrel as well as the flavors that you're getting from the wine, so that things are combined really well. What the bacteria assist me in doing is not only balancing that acid out, but they move those compounds, not only the wine compounds, but the oak compounds through their system, and they modify them and they bind them together. So when that vanilla character gets expressed, it gets expressed in a much more balanced way with the fruit characters. And that I do across all the wines. I just probably happen to mention it on that particular that sheet that you were reading. But that's a really key component to my winemaking thought process. And that goes back to what we were talking about with when I'm making a barrel choice, I'm thinking about how that barrel is going to be modified by the bacteria over the course of the 3 months that we let that fermentation happen.
So the bacteria you're talking about, is that, so you do the pressing, you put the yeast in, which eats the sugar, the bacteria, you're saying, use the malic acid, are you introducing the bacteria?
No, I don't introduce either. I don't introduce the yeast, nor do I introduce the bacteria. It's all native. Yep.
If you can make a choice where you induce the MF, either in a tank or in a barrel, is it time driven or driven more by temperature? Do you adjust the temperature to drive that?
It's very much driven by temperature, whichever vessel you're in.
Okay.
It comes down to several choices. One, I do it because the way that the bacteria combines the two different disparate flavors together, it finds it just tastes better. It combines them in a really decisive way, if you will. Now, I do that because I have the benefit of working for a family that can afford to do that, right? You could let that, and I told my interns this that are going on to future winemaking. One of the other decisions that you could do is you could let the malolactic go in the tank and then use less barrels that you might still get the same kind of barrel impact that I use, because the way that the bacteria consume some of those flavor compounds, you get less of an oak impact that way. Well, if you don't have the money for $1,000 each barrels, you can then, okay, I'm going to let the malolactic go through the tank, and hopefully I'll find that sweet spot with aging that kind of mimics what I do. There's a little more experimentation that you have to do that way, but it's a really good strategy if you're trying to save money. Yeah.
We've got a couple questions on the
Fantastic.
chat. So number one is from Ted. Congratulations to Chris on your 100-point WS Keys Merlot, which just came out on the 21.
Finally on the Merlot.
And how many 100 pointers do you have? Do you know?
No, I don't.
I think we're at, Barbie, are we at 26?
26.
No.
Well, congratulations to you. The next question is from Will H. on the line. Do you see similar contrasts in taste profiles with Cab Franc from Howell and Vider that you would with Cab Sauv?
Yeah, if you're comparing the two Cab Francs next to the two Cabernet Sauvignons, absolutely. They're Mount Brave and La Joda are a study not only of these killer vineyards that we own up there, but of the appellations. And that if we had, I mean, that should be our next tasting, a Lahota Cab Franc tasting, right?
I'm all for it.
If you had those here, if we had the Lahota in the same lineup, you would not misdiagnose what you have in front of you, because Lahota has a lot more of that middle palate. There's a lot more black fruit in Lahota in general. The tannins tend to be a little more rough to a degree, but broader. And there's a wee bit more herbal character on Howell versus Bieder.
And I love sharing the story. We were, Lahota just turned 125 last year, and we had to sit down and try 30 years of Lahota. And sounds awesome. There's some stuff that was not made by Chris. But the one thing that was just so cool to see is how mountain Cabernet Franc can just age gorgeously. So of course with Mount Brave, we don't have, 30 years on it at this point. I think on the table, the 1995 Cab Franc was the wine of the day.
Oh yeah, right.
So I'm really geeked out to see.
Was pretty good.
04 was pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you had a little bit of a hand in that, but yeah, Cabernet Franc can age. So if anyone is afraid, Cabernet Franc can't age, I disagree. I think it is a gorgeous varietal.
Now, to that point, Loire Cabernet Francs aren't made to age. They're made to consume.
Sure.
In the Aussies call them picnic wines. You buy a bottle, you take it out and picnic, and it's light. It's there's energy there for your day. These wines, all my Francs, are made to age. I want to see how they, selfishly, I want to see how they evolve over time. And it tastes like this gives me great hope.
Yeah, and speaking of ageability, we have another question from the chat. What's your target date for drinking the 2019s, would you say?
Oh, the 19, yeah, right. Well, what I'd recommend, and I'm sure Ryan would support me on this, is that you buy a case and and you have a bottle now and a bottle in a couple of years, and that's how you explore, much like we do here. I mean, I'm being a little bit trying to get a laugh, but in fact, that's the way to do it if you can. But the 19, I don't know, Brian, what do you think? 15 easily?
Oh, easily. And it is, I mean, you're looking at, for me right now, the sweet spot is 16, of course, the 2016. And that right now is almost 8 years old, let's say. I know we're just into 2024, but you have 8 years. It's just starting, in my opinion. So, stylistically, I mean, it's numbing my tongue with the acidity right now, that fruit tannin too, easily 15 years. But, not everyone has a different threshold, of course, and where they like their wines. I always joke as your consultant in sales in wine, yes, it can sit. But as your salesperson, if you want to drink it, go for it. I mean, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to stop you. But yes.
You just said it. It depends if you like more of the aged characters that like cedar and leather and cigar kind of character, or if you like fruit, and if you like tannin. I mean, tannins are something that everybody has a different threshold of enjoyment on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and if you've been here with me at my tastings, you'll know I go from acidity to tannin on my tastings. I like to see, where does your palate go? Do you like to be driven with acidity, or do you like that tannin grip? So that's the beauty of, and when people are sitting down and I'm hearing what they like about the particular wines and they're looking about Bordeaux, my secret ingredient is which Cab Franc do I pick for them at the end? I mean, that's really the secret. It's either Chris's Lahota, Howell Mountain, Chris's Higginbotham, Australian, or of course our Mount Brave Cab Franc. So future thinking here, 2021 is about to be re-released in a month, about 5 weeks, give or take. Tell us about what we can expect with the 21s.
Well, 21s we have a couple of great vintages in front of us, thankfully, because we didn't bottle any 20s. That was another year that we, even Franc didn't do well that year because the fires were so early that year. But 21 has this, it's got this intensity. It's got a spice to it. It has, again, an energy. And for me, wines have to have energy. They can't bring you down. They have to lift you up. And 21 has got full energy, and awesome. All the Francs that year are
So kind of like the 15, correct? Like low volume. We're talking about.
yeah, but I mean, we had low volume, different reasons, but it's different than the 15.
Yeah.
The 15 has a little bit of that savory that the 19 has, but the 21s are like they're awesome power driven wines and multi-level aromatics in the 21s.
But on that note, of all of your wines, which one are you most proud of? I know it's like saying which child you like the best, but taking that away.
What?
Keys Monroe, that got 100 points. Coming out next year.
No, in fact, he's whispering because he's just looking for
Pandering.
I'm all about the underdog. And I think that we have varieties that are clearly underdogs and that have as much resonance as far as the things that we like as wine drinkers as any variety. And you know, there's 100 varieties that you could put in that category. But one of them that is particularly meaningful for me is Merlot. I think, and it's also I'm very competitive, and Merlot in the world, in Franc too, but Merlot even more so from other countries is considered the most collectible wine that country may have to offer. You look at France with Petrus, and one of the most expensive wines in the world. One of the most collected wines out of Italy is a Merlot, a Seto. Australia and here, both places I work, we make Merlots, and I think these Merlots stand at the very best of them. And the WS Keys is meant to be the highest expression of that. That wine, I think, I wouldn't say that was my exact favorite, but is the wine that I'm always connected to as far as seeing how people react to it. And Cardinal to a great degree as well. And Cardinal mostly because of the creative side of my job and what the amount of right brain that goes into Cardinal versus all the other wines is probably the highest percentage. So when people react to Cardinal in a positive way, I get really excited about it.
So there's another question, I believe. No. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so of course the room, if you have questions, John.
If you could drink any California Cab Franc night,
Great question.
with dinner, which Cab Franc would you drink?
Minus his own, of course.
Or anyone else's?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, mine aside, a couple of them that I really like. Chapelet's made a beautiful Cab Franc for a lot of years. Bill Titus is I love that Cab Franc. I've turned a lot of people on to that wine. In fact, it just turned off. Lang & Reed makes a great Cab Franc as well. Probably one of the not old school, longest running brands next to La Hoda. My colleague at Verite makes a wonderful Cab Franc. Which one is that? The Le Joie.
Le Joie?
At Verite?
Yes.
Yeah.
Les Désir. Yeah.
It's a beautiful wine. So,
But
one of those.
for Italy, Paleo, Macchioli, it's probably one of the best Cabernet. I know you asked California, but whenever, I know you didn't ask me, but I'm interjecting. Yeah, okay, so I'll just leave. But Macchioli, Paleo,
I've never had.
best Cabernet Franc besides your own that I've ever had, quite frankly. Yeah.
Oh, let's get a bottle.
So,
1947.
Yeah.
I don't know if they made it back then. So I think that, I already put myself, out there. I said the 16. To me, just wherever it is, it's my favorite right now. That's the best way to describe it right now, the 16. What was your...
I'm thrilled with the 17.
The 17?
Yeah, where it's sitting right now. I think I love it.
That's fantastic. Wow. I think this was a fantastic, unique experience. Thank you for your time. I really do appreciate it. You just got back from Australia, in fact, if I remember. Yeah. So he's still probably like in the summer. Wait, summer, what was it? Was it going into?
It was glorious. The sun stayed up till 9 o'clock. So nice.
Well, and but that's okay. So how's that harvest going so far?
Well, we haven't started picking yet. In fact, that's why I was over there to figure out or try to figure out when I need to go back for the vintage. And I walked the vineyard from 8 in the morning till noon one day, and I probably saw out of the 100 acres I was in and around 3 berries that had started.
So another late one like Napa then potentially.
Yeah, well, they were showing a pretty early vintage for a while, and then they got a bunch of rain and it slowed everything down. So yeah, it's going to be mid to late March before we start picking there.
So I think questions are at this point, the Q&A are done. Jamie?
I have many questions.
Yeah, he's the last one.
Will we ever see, okay, so I'm the one that asked in the Merlot tasting about the Lahona Malbec because I still talk about that wine till this day.
Yep.
As
do I.
Also, Mount Brave single block, I love. I think it stands up to your higher priced wines. I actually did something a little ridiculous the other night and opened my 16 Cardinal, and granted different wines, but 16 Cardinal next to 18 Mount Brave single block, different vintage, different wine. But between the 4 of us, we all picked the 18 single block next to the 16. I don't know if we're more like acid driven people or what it was, but would you do another single block with like Merlot or Cab Franc or?
Well, the short answer is yes. I would, that Malbec, we actually made that Malbec again because 17, we didn't have a lot of wine. And the Malbec usually was a component of the Lahona Cabernet, which we didn't make. So these guys needed some wine to sell. I'm like, well, Malbec's pretty bloody good. Why don't we put it in the bottle? And we did. And I wrote my thesis on Malbec at Davis and where I got master's. But you have to. It's not just my decision. The marketing team has to be on board. The salespeople have to be on board, and we sell a lot of different wines. So there's that. The problem with the single block Viter project is that it does take away from the overall blend of the Mount Brave. Because it is the best portion from Mount Brave that is the single block. The rest of that wine goes in Mount Brave and forms the foundation. So if there's a year like these last couple of years where I don't have a lot of Cabernet from Mount Brave, that will get my attention first before the single block does.
So
I'm rooting for the Malbec.
Yeah, you talk to him.
Chris called me that one year and says, "Do you want me to make a Lahona Malbec?" And I said, "What else do you have?" He goes, "Pretty much nothing. You want 140 cases of Malbec?" I said, "Sure, let's do it." So, but we would
Was that was the only Lahona wine?
We had a little bit of Cab Franc and Merlot, and of course that Chardonnay.
Yeah,
the inaugural year of the Chardonnay. So you'll all notice, and of course you at home, you don't have it in front of you. But we do want to welcome you to, if there's just an absolute favorite of yours, we're not library pricing anything. So if one in particular vintages wasn't one of your favorites, they are $95, which is the current release price, whether it's the 14, whether it's the 16, you name it, $95 for NT vintage. And you just let us know. We're happy to place those orders for you, of course. But anyhow, thank you so much, all of my guests here. Thank you all in the World Wide Webs. Chris Carpenter, thank you, and bringing your masters here. And I want to thank you all. This was awesome. Cheers.